Alexander Grayson was a man who seemed to have everything: an empire of elite hotels spanning across continents, the prestige of being one of the most influential figures in the business world, and a wealth so vast that it insulated him from the mundane worries of everyday life. But as he sat in the grand living room of his newly purchased coastal mansion, staring at the dim light of the chandelier above, it all felt hollow. His life, once filled with power moves and ambitious goals, had been reduced to silence and shadows. His wife, Evelyn, the person who once gave meaning to his relentless drive, had been taken from him in a tragic accident a year ago. And now he was left with their two children, Theo and Lily, who were slipping further from his grasp with each passing day. Theo, just 10 years old, had retreated into himself after Evelyn's death, transforming from a vibrant, curious boy into a quiet, brooding child who barely spoke unless spoken to. He spent hours in his room, his nose buried in books far beyond his age, and avoided any conversations that ventured too close to feelings or memories. Lily, 7, had reacted differently. She clung to anything that reminded her of her mother: her perfume bottle, still sitting on the vanity, an old scarf that Evelyn used to wear on cold mornings, and even the stuffed rabbit she had outgrown years ago. The little girl was full of questions about death, about where her mother had gone, and about whether she was watching over them. Questions Alexander couldn't bring himself to answer. The mansion, sprawling and luxurious as it was, only seemed to amplify their grief. It was Evelyn's idea to move to the coast, to escape the noise of the city and give the children a fresh start. She had picked the house herself, marveling at its old-world charm and the way it seemed to stand timelessly against the crashing waves. But now, without her, it felt like a mausoleum filled with memories of what could have been and the deafening absence of her laughter. Alexander had thrown himself into his work after her death, burying his grief in endless meetings, emails, and negotiations. But no amount of distraction could mask the guilt that gnawed at him for leaving Theo and Lily to navigate their loss on their own. After months of struggling to balance his responsibilities as a father and a businessman, Alexander made a decision: he needed help. The children needed stability, someone who could be there for them when he couldn't. And so, the search for a nanny began. He interviewed countless candidates, each more qualified than the last, but none of them seemed right. They were too cold, too inexperienced, or too patronizing. He had almost given up when his assistant handed him one final resume. Adeline Bellamy. The name meant nothing to him, but her credentials were impeccable. Her references spoke of a woman with a natural ability to connect with children, a calming presence, and an intelligence that went beyond the expected. When Adeline arrived for the interview, Alexander was struck by how unassuming she seemed. Dressed simply in a dark green coat that accentuated her pale complexion and soft brown eyes, she carried herself with a quiet confidence. She didn't try to ingratiate herself with flattery or oversell her qualifications. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions about Theo and Lily: what their favorite activities were, what comforted them, what their biggest fears were. Alexander found himself sharing more about his children than he had with anyone else since Evelyn's passing. There was something about Adeline that made her seem trustworthy, almost familiar, though he couldn't place why. Within a week, Adeline had moved into the mansion's guest quarters, and it didn't take long for her presence to start making an impact. Lily, who had been clinging to her stuffed rabbit like a lifeline, started to spend more time with Adeline, helping her bake cookies in the kitchen or wandering through the garden. Theo, initially wary and distant, slowly began to open up during their shared chess games, where Adeline let him win just often enough to keep him engaged. Alexander was relieved. For the first time in a long time, the house felt a little less suffocating. But as the days turned into weeks, Alexander began to notice things about Adeline that unsettled him. It wasn't anything overt, just small, almost imperceptible details. She seemed to know her way around the mansion a little too well for someone who had only just moved in. Once he caught her standing in the hallway outside the children's bedrooms, staring at the wall with an intensity that made him pause. When he asked if everything was all right, she smiled softly and said she was just admiring the house's craftsmanship. Another time, she found an old music box in the attic and presented it to Lily, who claimed it had belonged to her mother even though Alexander was sure Evelyn had never owned such a thing. The children adored her, and Alexander couldn't deny that she had brought a sense of calm to their lives that had been missing since Evelyn's death. But there were moments when he couldn't shake the feeling that Adeline was hiding something. Her movements were deliberate, her words carefully chosen, and there was a sadness in her eyes that hinted at a past she wasn't sharing. Late one night, as he walked past her room on his way to the study, he overheard her speaking softly to herself or to someone else. The words were indistinct, but there was an urgency in her tone that made him stop and listen. When he finally knocked on her door, the room was silent. She opened it with a serene expression, as though nothing had happened. "I was just reading," she explained, holding up a weathered book that looked older than anything in the house. Alexander nodded, but his suspicions only deepened. He tried to dismiss his unease as paranoia. After all, Adeline had done nothing but help his family heal. But there were moments when he caught her looking at Theo and Lily with an expression that was hard to define. It wasn't maternal or protective. It was knowing. And sometimes, when the children spoke of Evelyn, Adeline seemed to flinch, as though the mention of her name carried a weight that Alexander couldn't understand. The mansion itself seemed to change in subtle ways after Adeline's arrival. Doors that had always creaked now opened silently. The light in the hallway outside the children's rooms flickered at odd hours, even after the electrician had come to fix it. Lily began drawing pictures of a woman in a long dress with a kind smile, insisting that it was the nice lady who watches us when we sleep. When Alexander pressed her for more details, she just shrugged and said, "She's not scary, Daddy. She says she's here to keep us safe." As much as Alexander wanted to believe it was just a child's imagination, he couldn't ignore the growing sense that something about Adeline and the house itself wasn't entirely normal. He began to wonder if hiring her had been a mistake, or if, perhaps, she had come into their lives for a reason he was only beginning to glimpse. The house was unusually quiet the evening it happened, the kind of silence that feels almost deliberate, as if the air itself is holding its breath. Alexander sat in his office, the amber glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His work spreadsheets, emails, projections lay ignored in front of him. Despite his best efforts to focus, his mind kept drifting back to the oddities of the past few weeks. Adeline had brought a newfound peace to the house, but she had also brought questions. Questions he couldn't answer, no matter how hard he tried to rationalize them. It was Theo who broke the silence. His voice was frantic, echoing down the hall as he shouted for his father. Alexander sprang from his chair, his heart already racing as he bolted toward the sound. He found Theo standing in the doorway of Lily's room, his face pale, his hands trembling. "She's gone," Theo stammered, his voice breaking. "Lily's gone." Alexander's stomach dropped. He pushed past Theo and scanned the room, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing, or rather, not seeing. Lily's bed was empty, the covers thrown back as if she had simply gotten up and left. But her favorite stuffed rabbit was still there, lying on the floor near the window, which was firmly shut. There was no sign of her anywhere. "She was just here," Theo insisted, his voice rising with panic. "We were talking, and then, I don't know. I looked away for a second, and she was gone." Adeline appeared in the doorway, her face calm but her eyes sharp, taking in every detail of the scene. "What happened?" she asked, her voice steady in a way that only made Alexander's own panic feel more out of control. "Lily's missing," he said, his words clipped and urgent. "We need to find her. She couldn't have gone far." Adeline didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped into the room and closed her eyes, standing perfectly still as if listening for something only she could hear. After a moment, she opened her eyes and turned to Alexander. "She's still in the house," she said with certainty. "How can you possibly know that?" Alexander demanded, his frustration boiling over. "We need to check outside. What if someone took her?" "No one took her," Adeline said firmly. "Trust me on this. She's here." Her confidence was infuriating, but something in her tone stopped Alexander from arguing further. Instead, he focused on the immediate task of finding his daughter. He and Theo began searching every room, every corner, every hidden space they could think of, calling Lily's name until their voices grew hoarse. Adeline, however, didn't join the frantic search. Instead, she moved through the house with deliberate slowness, as if following an invisible trail. It was Adeline who found her. Alexander heard her voice first, low and soothing, coming from the direction of the basement. He and Theo rushed down the stairs to find Adeline crouched on the cold concrete floor, Lily cradled in her arms. The little girl was awake but dazed, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Around them, a strange pattern had been drawn on the floor in what looked like chalk intricate, swirling symbols that Alexander didn't recognize. "What is this?" Alexander demanded, his voice echoing off the basement walls. "What's going on down here?" Adeline looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "She was drawn here," she said simply, as if that explained anything. "Drawn here by what?" Alexander snapped. "And what are these symbols? Did you do this?" "No," Adeline said calmly. "They were already here." Alexander's frustration turned to anger. "You're not making any sense," he said, pulling Lily away from her and lifting the girl into his arms. "We're going upstairs, and in the morning, you're going to explain exactly what's going on in this house, or you can pack your things and leave." Adeline didn't argue. She simply nodded and stood, brushing the chalk dust from her hands. "Get her some rest," she said quietly. "She'll be fine now." That night, Alexander barely slept. He sat by Lily's bedside, watching her chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of sleep, his mind racing with questions. What had happened in the basement? How had those symbols gotten there? And why did Adeline seem to know so much more than she was letting on? The next morning, true to his word, Alexander confronted her. He found her in the kitchen, brewing tea as if it were any other day. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and tense. "I thought you might say that," Adeline replied, setting the teapot down and folding her hands on the counter. Alexander didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What happened last night?" he demanded. "What were those symbols in the basement? And how did you know where to find Lily?" Adeline met his gaze, her expression calm but serious. "There's something you need to understand about this house," she began. "It's different. Places like this, with so much history, they don't just exist in the present. They hold on to the past, to the people who've lived here, to the things they've experienced. Sometimes, those things don't stay in the past where they belong." Alexander stared at her, struggling to process what she was saying. "Are you trying to tell me this house is haunted?" he asked, his tone half incredulous, half angry. "Not haunted," Adeline corrected, "but it remembers. And sometimes those memories can bleed through." "Bleed through?" Alexander repeated, his voice rising. "What does that even mean? And what does it have to do with Lily?" Adeline hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "I believe the house was calling to her," she said finally. Something here recognized her. Alexander's patience snapped. Recognized her? She's a child, not some kind of medium. You're talking nonsense. I know how it sounds, Adeline said, her voice calm but firm. But you felt it too, haven't you? The way the air changes sometimes, the way the light shifts, the way this house seems alive. Alexander opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He had felt it, the strange sense of being watched, the way certain rooms felt colder than others, even when the heat was on. But admitting that felt like crossing a line he wasn't ready to cross. This is ridiculous, he said finally, shaking his head. You're making things up to scare me. I'm not trying to scare you, Adeline said. I'm trying to help you understand. This house is more than just walls and floors. It has a history, and that history is tied to your family now. My family? Alexander repeated, his voice heavy with skepticism. What are you saying? Adeline hesitated again, then took a deep breath. I think your wife knew, she said quietly. I think that's why she chose this house. The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. What are you talking about? He demanded. Evelyn didn't know anything about this house. She just liked the view. Are you sure? Adeline asked, her voice soft but insistent. Did she ever say why she wanted to move here? Did she ever mention anything about its history? Alexander frowned, the memories of their conversations about the house coming back to him in fragments. Evelyn had been unusually insistent about buying the property, even when Alexander had expressed doubts. She'd said it felt right, that it was meant to be. At the time, he dismissed it as her romanticizing the idea of a coastal home. But now, with Adeline's words echoing in his mind, he wasn't so sure. I don't know, he admitted finally. Maybe she did, but what does that have to do with any of this? Adeline's gaze was steady. I think she brought you here for a reason, she said. And I think Lily is connected to that reason. This house, it's not finished with you yet. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what Adeline meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Something about the house, about Evelyn's choice to bring them here, didn't add up. And whether he liked it or not, he was going to have to find out why. Days passed, but the unease within Alexander only deepened. Despite Adeline's explanations, or perhaps because of them, he found himself unable to trust her completely. The way she spoke about the house, as if it were a living entity with its own desires, unnerved him. And yet, he couldn't deny that her presence had brought a strange stability to their lives. Theo had begun spending more time outside his room, even joining Adeline in the kitchen to help prepare meals. Lily, meanwhile, seemed happier, though she occasionally lapsed into moments of quiet introspection that reminded Alexander of the incident in the basement. He had tried to push the memory of that night out of his mind, but it lingered like a shadow, always at the edge of his thoughts. The symbols on the basement floor, Adeline's calm certainty that Lily had been called there, none of it made sense, and yet it felt disturbingly real. Alexander had considered sending Adeline away, but the children had grown attached to her, and he couldn't bring himself to uproot their fragile sense of stability. Still, he kept a closer eye on her, looking for anything that might confirm or dispel his suspicions. It wasn't long before he found something. One evening, as he worked late in his study, he heard footsteps echoing down the hall. They were soft, deliberate, and heading toward the back of the house. At first, he assumed it was one of the children, but a quick glance at the clock told him it was far past their bedtime. Rising from his desk, he followed the sound, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floors. The footsteps led him to the old servant's staircase, a narrow and winding passage that descended into the lower levels of the house. Alexander hesitated at the top of the stairs, the darkness below seeming to press against him like a physical weight. He hadn't spent much time in this part of the house. Most of it was unused storage space, but now he felt compelled to follow. As he descended, the air grew colder, and the faint sound of murmured voices reached his ears. Rounding the final curve of the staircase, he stopped abruptly. There, in the dim glow of a single flickering candle, stood Adeline. She was kneeling on the floor, her head bowed as she traced a symbol onto the dusty surface with her fingertip. The symbol was intricate, almost geometric, and it reminded him uncomfortably of the ones he had seen in the basement. "Adeline," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet. She flinched but didn't look up. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I could say the same to you," Alexander replied, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" Adeline finally raised her head, her expression unreadable. "I'm protecting your family," she said simply. "Protecting us from what?" he demanded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "And don't give me any more cryptic nonsense about the house remembering things. I want the truth." For a moment she seemed to consider his words, her gaze steady. Then she sighed and rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her hands. "This house isn't like others," she began, her voice low. "It was built on a place that was never meant to be lived in, a place where the boundaries between worlds are thin." Alexander frowned, his skepticism warring with the unease that had taken root in his mind. "What are you talking about?" "There are places in the world," Adeline continued, "where the past lingers, where emotions, memories, and even people can leave imprints. This house was built on one of those places, and sometimes those imprints don't stay dormant. They can awaken, especially when they sense something familiar." "Something familiar?" Alexander repeated. "You mean Lily?" Adeline nodded. "And Theo. They're sensitive to it. The house recognizes them, connects with them in ways it doesn't with most people. That's why Lily was drawn to the basement. It wasn't random." Alexander stared at her, his mind racing. "And you? Where do you fit into all of this? You seem to know more about this house than anyone should." She hesitated, and for the first time he saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I have a history with this place," she admitted. "My family, we were caretakers of sorts. Not for the house itself, but for the land it was built on. We knew its dangers, its power. When I saw your name on the job listing, I knew I had to come back. I couldn't let this place take another family." Her words sent a chill down Alexander's spine. "Take another family," he echoed. "What are you saying?" Adeline's expression darkened. "You've seen the portraits in the gallery, haven't you? The ones of the original owners?" He nodded slowly, remembering the faded images of a family that had once lived here, parents, children, their faces frozen in time. "They vanished," Adeline said. "All of them. No one knows exactly what happened, but their disappearance wasn't natural. The house consumed them, or something within it did." Alexander's first instinct was to dismiss her words as madness, but the conviction in her tone made it impossible to ignore. "If this house is so dangerous, why hasn't anyone else who lived here disappeared?" he asked. "Because it's dormant most of the time," Adeline replied. "But certain events can wake it up. Tragedy, loss, strong emotions, they act as a kind of trigger. And your family's arrival after what happened to Evelyn, it was enough to stir it." The mention of his wife's name was like a blow to the chest. "What does Evelyn have to do with this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I think she felt it," Adeline said softly, "even before you moved in. That's why she chose this house. She may not have understood it fully, but she was drawn to it, just like Lily and Theo are now." Alexander turned away, his thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and fear. He wanted to believe that Adeline was lying, that she was delusional, but too many pieces of the puzzle fit together too neatly. The house, the symbols, the unshakable feeling that something was watching them, it all pointed to a truth he wasn't ready to face. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked finally, his voice heavy. "Because things are escalating," Adeline said. The more the house connects with your family, the stronger its pull will become. Lily's incident in the basement was just the beginning. If we don't take action, it will only get worse. And what exactly do you propose we do? Alexander asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Adeline hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn book. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. "This is a record of everything my family knew about this place," she said. "It contains rituals, protections, things we can use to keep your family safe, but it won't be easy. The house, it doesn't like interference." Alexander took the book reluctantly, his fingers brushing against the weathered cover. "And what happens if we don't do this?" Adeline's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Then the house will take what it wants," she said, "and it won't stop at your children." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with foreboding. Alexander didn't know if he could trust her, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Whatever was happening in this house, it was real, and it was coming for his family. That night, as he lay awake in bed, clutching the worn book to his chest, Alexander felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him like never before. He had spent so long trying to shield his children from pain, from fear, from the chaos of the world outside. But now, it seemed, the greatest threat was coming from within the very walls of their home, and he had no idea how to stop it. The house had always been quiet at night, but now the silence felt hostile. It was the kind of stillness that magnified every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows, until it seemed the house itself was alive, holding its breath. Alexander had spent days poring over the worn book Adeline had given him, trying to make sense of the strange diagrams and cryptic notes scrawled in its pages. It spoke of thin places, thresholds between worlds where time and reality blurred, and of the rituals meant to contain the forces that seeped through. But the instructions were incomplete, fragmented, and written in a language Alexander didn't fully understand. The more he read, the more he felt like he was grasping at shadows, trying to hold on to something that would always slip through his fingers. Adeline, meanwhile, had taken on an almost militant determination. She moved through the house with a purpose that unnerved Alexander, leaving small chalk marks on walls and sprinkling salt in strange patterns near the windows. She spoke little, her usual calm demeanor replaced by something sharper, more urgent. The children seemed to sense the change too. Theo watched her with wary eyes, his natural skepticism growing into something closer to suspicion. Lily, on the other hand, seemed to trust Adeline implicitly, following her around like a shadow and mimicking her actions when she thought no one was looking. Alexander tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was a losing battle. The atmosphere in the house had shifted, and even the children couldn't escape it. Theo, who had always been so logical and grounded, started waking up in the middle of the night, claiming he'd heard voices whispering his name. Lily became more withdrawn, spending hours staring at the old mirror in her room, as if it held answers only she could see. When Alexander asked her what she was doing, she would simply smile and say, "They're not scary, Daddy. They just want to talk." It was Lily's behavior that finally pushed Alexander to confront Adeline. One evening, after the children were asleep, he found her in the sitting room, kneeling before the fireplace with her back to him. She was tracing something into the ash with her fingertip, a symbol that looked eerily similar to the ones he'd seen in the basement. "This has to stop," he said, his voice low but firm. Adeline didn't turn around. "What has to stop?" she asked calmly, continuing her work. "Whatever it is you're doing," Alexander snapped. "The symbols, the rituals, the way you're filling my children's heads with these ideas. Theo thinks he's hearing voices. Lily is talking to mirrors. Do you have any idea what you're doing to them?" Adeline finally looked up, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him falter. "I'm protecting them," she said. "Whether you believe it or not, there are things in this house that don't belong here. Things that are drawn to your family. If I stop now, they'll have free rein. Is that what you want?" "I want my children to feel safe," Alexander said through gritted teeth. "And right now they don't." Adeline stood, brushing the ash from her hands. "Then maybe you should start listening to them," she said. "They're not imagining things, Alexander. They're seeing the truth of this house. The truth you refuse to accept." Alexander wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he couldn't. Not entirely. Because the truth was, he had started seeing things, too, shadows that didn't belong, fleeting glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision. He had written them off as tricks of the light, the product of too many sleepless nights. But now he wasn't so sure. "What are we dealing with?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now. "What's really happening here?" Adeline hesitated, and for a moment, Alexander thought she wouldn't answer. But then she took a deep breath and said, "This house, it's more than just a building. It's a gateway, a place where the barriers between worlds are thin. Most of the time, those barriers hold. But when there's enough pain, enough loss, enough emotion, they weaken. Things slip through, things that were never meant to exist here." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of things?" Adeline's gaze didn't waver. "Memories, echoes, sometimes more than that. Sometimes they take on a life of their own. They become hungry." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alexander swallowed hard, his throat dry. "And you think that's what's happening now? That something's come through?" Adeline nodded. "I know it has. I've seen the signs. The whispers, the shadows, the way the house seems to shift. It's only a matter of time before it escalates." "Escalates to what?" Alexander asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "To possession," Adeline said bluntly. "It starts small, drawing people in, influencing their thoughts, their actions. But eventually it takes over. It becomes part of them, and they become part of it." Alexander felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy blanket. He thought of Lily, staring into the mirror with that faraway look in her eyes. He thought of Theo, lying awake at night, listening to voices only he could hear. And he thought of Evelyn, of the way she had been so insistent on buying this house, as if she had known it would call to them. "What do we do?" he asked finally. Adeline hesitated, her expression unreadable. "We need to perform a ritual," she said. "One that will strengthen the barriers and force whatever's here back to where it came from. But it won't be easy. The house won't let us do it without a fight." Alexander stared at her, the full weight of her words sinking in. "A fight," he repeated. "You mean it's going to try to stop us?" Adeline nodded. "It already has. The voices, the shadows, their warnings. If we don't act soon, it'll get worse. Much worse." The thought of putting his children through something like that made Alexander's stomach turn. But what choice did he have? If Adeline was right, and the house truly was a threat, he couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. "Fine," he said. "Tell me what we need to do." The ritual, as it turned out, was more complicated than Alexander had anticipated. It required specific items, candles, herbs, and other materials that Adeline claimed would anchor their intentions and amplify their efforts. Some of the items were easy enough to find, while others were more obscure, forcing Alexander to visit shops he'd never even noticed before. By the time he returned to the house with the last of the supplies, it was nearly midnight, and the children were fast asleep. Adeline wasted no time. She set to work preparing the space, arranging the candles in a precise pattern on the floor of the sitting room, and sprinkling the herbs in a circle around them. She moved with an efficiency that suggested she had done this before, though Alexander didn't dare ask when or why. His job was to watch the children and keep them safe, though he wasn't sure how he was supposed to do that if the house decided to turn on them. As Adeline lit the first candle, the air in the room seemed to change. It grew heavier, thicker, as if the house itself was aware of what they were doing and didn't approve. The flickering candlelight cast strange shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. Alexander watched in silence as Adeline began to chant, her voice low and rhythmic, the unfamiliar words filling the space with an almost tangible energy. At first, nothing happened. But then, slowly, the shadows began to deepen, pooling in the corners of the room like spilled ink. The temperature dropped sharply, and Alexander could see his breath fogging in the air. A low hum filled the room, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second, until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. "Stay focused," Adeline said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Don't let it distract you." Alexander nodded, though he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his composure. The shadows were moving now, creeping across the floor toward the circle of candles. One of them brushed against the edge of the salt line, and the flame nearest it flickered violently, as if struggling to stay lit. "Is this supposed to happen?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with fear. Adeline didn't answer. She was too focused on the ritual, her chant growing louder and more urgent as the shadows pressed closer. The hum had become a roar now, deafening in its intensity, and Alexander felt as though his skull might split from the pressure. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room fell silent, the air still and heavy. The shadows retreated, melting back into the corners as if they had never been there. The candles burned steadily once more, their flames unwavering. Adeline lowered her hands, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Did it work?" he asked. Adeline met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "For now," she said, but this was only the beginning. In the days following the ritual, the house seemed quieter, almost serene. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air before was gone, and for the first time in weeks, Alexander felt as though he could breathe again. The children seemed calmer too. Theo no longer complained about hearing whispers at night, and Lily stopped staring into the mirror in her room. Even Adeline seemed more relaxed, her sharp movements softening into something closer to her earlier calm. But Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that the peace was temporary, that the house was simply biding its time. And when the shadows began to return, his worst fears were confirmed. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. One morning, as Alexander was getting dressed, he noticed a faint mark on the wall of his bedroom, a dark smudge that hadn't been there the night before. At first, he dismissed it as nothing more than a stain, a trick of the light. But by the next evening, the mark had grown, stretching across the wall like a crack in the plaster. And it wasn't just his room. Similar marks began appearing throughout the house, thin black streaks that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Adeline inspected the marks with a grim expression. "It's a warning," she said. "The house is reacting to what we did. It knows we tried to push it back, and now it's pushing back against us." "What does that mean?" Alexander asked, his voice tight with frustration. "I thought the ritual was supposed to stop this." "It did," Adeline replied. "But only temporarily. Whatever's here, it's stronger than I realized. The ritual weakened it, but it's still trying to reassert itself. And now it knows we're a threat." Her words sent a chill down Alexander's spine. "What do we do now?" "We need to prepare," Adeline said. The house isn't going to let us go so easily. It's going to fight us, and we need to be ready for whatever it throws our way." Alexander wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but the look in Adeline's eyes silenced him. She wasn't just worried, she was afraid. And if someone as composed as Adeline was scared, then Alexander knew he had every reason to be terrified. That night, the children woke up screaming. Alexander burst into Lily's room first, his heart pounding as he threw open the door. She was sitting up in bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "It was in my room, Daddy," she sobbed. "It was standing right there." "What was?" Alexander asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The lady," Lily whispered. "The one from the mirror. She said she wanted to take me with her." Alexander's blood ran cold. He turned to Theo's room, where Adeline was already standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. Theo was sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands gripping the covers tightly. "She talked to me too," he said quietly. "She said we don't belong here." Adeline knelt beside him, her voice calm and soothing. "What else did she say, Theo?" "She said she's trapped," Theo replied. "That she needs our help to get out." Adeline exchanged a glance with Alexander, her expression grim. "She's lying," she said firmly. "Don't listen to her, Theo. Whatever she told you, it's not true." "But she sounded so sad," Theo said, his voice trembling, like she just wanted to go home. Adeline shook her head. "That's how it starts. She makes you feel sorry for her, makes you trust her. And once you do, she'll take what she wants." "What does she want?" Alexander asked, his voice low. Adeline hesitated before answering. "Your children," she said finally. "They're the key. They're what's keeping her here, and she'll do whatever it takes to get to them." Alexander felt a surge of anger and fear rise within him. "Then we need to get out of this house," he said. "We need to leave now." "It's not that simple," Adeline said. "The house won't let you go. Not while she's still tied to it." "What are you saying?" Alexander demanded. "That we're trapped here?" "For now, yes," Adeline said. "But there's a way to break the connection. We just need time to figure it out." "Time?" Alexander repeated, his voice rising. "We don't have time. My children are being targeted, and you're telling me to wait." "I'm telling you to trust me," Adeline said sharply. "I've dealt with this before, Alexander. I know how to handle it, but I can't do it alone." Her words hit him like a slap. He wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the desperation in her eyes stopped him. She was trying to help, even if her methods didn't make sense to him. And right now, she was the only one who seemed to know what they were up against. "Fine," he said finally. "But if anything happens to my children—" "It won't," Adeline said, cutting him off. "I won't let it." The next few days were a blur of activity. Adeline began reinforcing the protective measures she had put in place before, sprinkling salt along the windowsills and doors, drawing new symbols on the walls, and hanging small charms made of twigs and string in the corners of the rooms. She explained that these measures wouldn't stop the entity entirely, but would slow it down, giving them more time to figure out how to sever its connection to the house. Alexander, meanwhile, focused on the children. He kept them close, refusing to let them out of his sight for more than a few minutes at a time. Theo was withdrawn, his usual skepticism replaced by a quiet fear that made Alexander's heart ache. Lily, on the other hand, seemed almost eerily calm, as if she had resigned herself to whatever was happening. It was a stark contrast to her earlier outbursts, and it unnerved Alexander more than anything else. The breaking point came one night when the shadows returned. Alexander had been sitting in the living room, keeping watch while the children slept, when he noticed a faint movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but then the shadows began to coalesce, pooling together in the far corner of the room. They moved unnaturally, twisting and writhing like living things. Adeline appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with determination. "It's starting," she said. "We need to act now." "What do you mean, it's starting?" Alexander asked, his voice taut with fear. "She's testing the boundaries," Adeline replied, "trying to see how far she can go. If we don't stop her now, she'll take control." "Control of what?" Alexander demanded. "Everything," Adeline said simply. "The house, the children, you. She'll consume it all." The words sent a jolt of terror through Alexander, but there was no time to dwell on it. The shadows were advancing now, creeping across the floor toward them. Adeline stepped forward, her voice rising as she began to chant in that strange, rhythmic language Alexander had heard before. The shadows recoiled at the sound, but they didn't retreat completely. "Get the children," Adeline said over her shoulder. "Take them to the basement. It's the only place that's safe." Alexander didn't hesitate. He ran to the children's rooms, scooping Lily up in his arms and pulling Theo along by the hand. They didn't ask questions, their fear rendering them silent as they followed their father down the narrow staircase to the basement. The air was damp and cold, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the darkness. Adeline joined them moments later, her face pale but resolute. She carried a small satchel filled with herbs, candles, and other items Alexander didn't recognize. "We're going to end this," she said, her voice firm, "but I need your help." "Tell me what to do," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Adeline began arranging the candles in a circle, her movements quick and precise. "This ritual will sever her connection to the house," she explained, "but it requires a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Alexander asked, his stomach twisting with dread. Adeline met his gaze, her eyes filled with a sorrow that made his heart sink. "The house has tied itself to your family," she said. "To break that connection, we need to give it something in return." "Something like what?" Alexander pressed. Adeline hesitated, then said, "Someone. A life." The words hit him like a physical blow. "No," he said immediately. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Adeline said firmly. "I've tried every other option. This is the only way." Alexander looked at his children, his heart breaking at the thought of losing either of them. "It can't be them," he said, his voice shaking. "I won't let it." "It won't be them," Adeline said. "It'll be me." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. "What are you talking about?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm the one who brought this on your family," Adeline said. "I thought I could protect you, but I underestimated her strength. This is my mess, and I'm going to fix it." Before Alexander could respond, Adeline stepped into the circle of candles and began to chant. The air grew heavy, the shadows swirling around her like a living storm. Alexander reached out to stop her, but Theo grabbed his arm, his voice trembling. "Dad, don't. She knows what she's doing." Alexander hesitated, his heart breaking as he watched Adeline's form begin to blur, her body fading into the swirling darkness. Her voice rose above the chaos, strong and unwavering, until it was the only sound in the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shadows disappeared, the candles flickering out one by one. The air was still, the basement eerily quiet. Adeline was gone. Alexander sank to his knees, his arms wrapping around his children as they clung to him, their tears soaking into his shirt. He didn't know what had just happened, or if it was truly over. But one thing was certain, they would never be the same. The house was still, unnaturally so, in the wake of Adeline's disappearance. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on Alexander and his children, like a weight they couldn't escape. They sat in the dim light of the basement, too stunned to move, too overwhelmed to speak. Adeline's final chant still echoed faintly in Alexander's mind, each syllable haunting and unrelenting. She was gone, vanished into the swirling darkness that had engulfed her. And yet the air didn't feel lighter. If anything, it felt heavier, thicker with an ominous energy that seemed to seep from the very walls. Is she coming back? Lily's voice was small, barely a whisper, but it cut through the suffocating silence like a blade. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, her wide eyes fixed on the space where Adeline had stood moments before. I don't know, Alexander admitted, his own voice trembling. He couldn't bring himself to lie to her. Not now, not when everything felt so fragile, as though one wrong word could shatter the tenuous grip they had on reality. Theo, ever the pragmatist even in the face of fear, looked at his father with a furrowed brow. You felt it, didn't you? He said, his voice steadier than Alexander would have expected. She said it would end, but it hasn't. It's still here. Alexander didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. The truth was as clear to him as it was to Theo. The house hadn't let go. Whatever Adeline had done, it hadn't been enough. The shadows weren't gone, they were waiting. He could feel them, lurking just beyond the edges of his perception, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We need to leave, Alexander said finally, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his chest. We'll go somewhere safe, somewhere far from here. Theo shook his head. We can't. You know that. The house won't let us. Alexander opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He couldn't deny the truth in his son's words. Every attempt to escape had been thwarted, doors that wouldn't open, hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly, and the overwhelming sense of being herded back to where they started. The house wasn't just a building, it was a predator, and they were trapped in its jaws. Still, he refused to give up. He pulled Lily close, wrapping his arms around her trembling form, and placed a hand on Theo's shoulder. I don't care what the house wants, he said, his voice filled with a determination he barely felt. We're not going to let it win. We'll find a way out. Together. It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but it was enough to get them moving. Together, they climbed the narrow staircase back to the main floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house greeted them with an eerie quiet, the kind that felt purposeful, deliberate. The marks on the walls, the strange black streaks that had begun appearing days earlier had grown, spreading like cracks through the plaster. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, as if aware of their presence. We can't stay here, Alexander said again, more to himself than to the children. He moved quickly, ushering Theo and Lily toward the front door. But as he reached for the handle, the air around him seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stir, slithering across the floor like living things. Theo grabbed his arm. Dad, it's happening again. I see it, Alexander said through gritted teeth. He pulled harder on the door, but it refused to budge. It was as if the house itself was holding it shut, mocking his efforts. Lily whimpered, pressing herself against his side. She's coming, she whispered, her voice trembling. The lady from the mirror. She's coming. Alexander turned to her, his heart hammering in his chest. Lily, what do you mean? What do you see? She's here, Lily said, pointing toward the large mirror that hung in the hallway. Her eyes were wide with terror, her small body trembling. She's watching us. Alexander followed her gaze, his breath catching in his throat. The surface of the mirror was no longer reflective, it was dark, impossibly dark, like a pool of ink that absorbed all light. And within that darkness, a figure began to emerge. It was faint at first, barely discernible, but it grew clearer with each passing second. A woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with a terrible hunger. The figure raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass. The mirror shuddered, the surface rippling like water. And then the hand began to push through. "Run!" Alexander shouted, grabbing Lily and pulling her away from the mirror. Theo followed close behind, his footsteps pounding against the floor as they fled deeper into the house. But the shadows were faster. They surged forward, filling the hallway like a tidal wave, cutting off their path and forcing them to retreat into the sitting room. "We can't outrun it," Theo said, his voice frantic. "What do we do?" Alexander scanned the room, his mind racing. The symbols Adeline had drawn on the walls were still there, faint but visible. They had worked before, maybe they could work again. "Get behind me," he told the children. He grabbed a piece of chalk from the fireplace mantel and began tracing over the symbols, his hands shaking as he worked. The shadows pressed closer, their presence suffocating, but he forced himself to keep moving. "Dad, hurry," Theo shouted, his voice filled with panic. "I'm trying." Alexander snapped, his heart pounding. The chalk broke in his hand, and he cursed under his breath, grabbing another piece and continuing the pattern. The shadows were nearly upon them when the first symbol flared to life. A brilliant white light erupted from the wall, pushing the darkness back and filling the room with a blinding glow. The shadows recoiled, retreating to the edges of the room, but they didn't disappear entirely. "It's not enough," Theo said, his voice shaking. "We need more." Alexander nodded, his mind racing. The book, the worn, weathered book Adeline had left behind, might hold the answer. "Stay here," he told the children. "I'll be right back." "No," Lily cried, clinging to his arm. "Don't leave us." "I have to," Alexander said, his voice firm but gentle. "I need the book. It's the only way to stop this." He pried her fingers from his arm and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The shadows followed him, slithering along the walls and floor, but he didn't stop. The book was in the study, exactly where he had left it, and he grabbed it without hesitation. As he turned to leave, the air grew colder, and the darkness around him deepened. The figure from the mirror was there, standing in the doorway, blocking his path. Her hollow eyes met his, and for a moment he couldn't move. "You can't save them," she said, her voice a low, guttural whisper. "They belong to me." "Over my dead body," Alexander growled. He clutched the book tightly and ran straight at her, his shoulder colliding with hers as he forced his way through the doorway. The figure let out a shriek, a sound so piercing it felt like it would split his skull, but he kept running. When he reached the sitting room, the children were huddled together, their faces pale with fear. "I've got it," he said, holding up the book. "We're going to end this." He flipped through the pages, searching for the ritual Adeline had mentioned, a final severance, a way to banish the entity once and for all. The instructions were cryptic, filled with symbols and incantations that made little sense to him, but he didn't have time to hesitate. He began reading aloud, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. The shadows screamed in response, their forms writhing and twisting as the light from the symbols grew brighter. The figure from the mirror appeared again, her gaunt face contorted with rage. She lunged at Alexander, but this time the light held her back, burning her as she tried to break through. "Keep going, Dad," Theo shouted, his voice filled with hope. Alexander didn't stop. He read faster, the words spilling from his lips like a river, until the book itself began to glow. The light spread, consuming the room, the house, and finally the shadows. The figure let out one final, anguished scream before disintegrating into nothingness. And then it was over. The house was silent once more, the oppressive weight lifted. Alexander sank to his knees, the book slipping from his hands as relief and exhaustion washed over him. "Is it gone?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Alexander said, pulling her into his arms. "It's gone. We're safe now." But even as he said the words, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't done with them yet. The days following the ritual were a blur of exhaustion and uneasy calm. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house was silent. The oppressive weight that had lingered in every corner seemed to have lifted, replaced by an almost unnatural stillness. Alexander moved through the rooms like a man walking through the aftermath of a storm, checking doors, inspecting windows, and stopping to trace his fingers over the faint remnants of the symbols Adeline had drawn on the walls. They had saved them, but at what cost? Adeline was gone. Her final act of sacrifice had bought them their freedom, but Alexander couldn't shake the hollow ache in his chest. She had been a stranger when she entered their lives, but in her quiet way, she had become part of their family. She had protected his children when he didn't know how, had fought for them when he couldn't, and now she was lost to the shadows, to the house, to whatever realm lay beyond its walls. He didn't know if she was truly gone, or if some part of her remained, watching over them like she always had. The thought gave him little comfort. The children, too, were struggling to make sense of what had happened. Theo had retreated into himself again, his sharp mind racing to rationalize the impossible. He spent hours flipping through books in the library, searching for answers that Alexander knew he wouldn't find. Lily, on the other hand, had grown quiet and solemn, as if some part of her still lingered in the house's grasp. She rarely let go of her stuffed rabbit, clutching it tightly as though it were a lifeline. She didn't talk about the lady from the mirror anymore, but Alexander often caught her staring into reflective surfaces, as if she expected to see someone staring back. Alexander tried to keep things normal. He cooked breakfast, played games with the children, and even sat down to watch one of Lily's favorite cartoons. But the house itself refused to let them forget. The marks on the walls, the dark, creeping streaks had faded but hadn't disappeared entirely. The air, though no longer suffocating, still carried a faint chill, a reminder of what had transpired. And at night, when the house was at its quietest, Alexander could still feel it watching. He decided they needed to leave. Whatever had tied them to this house might have been severed, but the memories of what had happened here were too strong, too vivid. They needed a fresh start, a new home far from the shadows and secrets that had consumed their lives. Packing was easier than he expected. Despite the house's ominous presence, it didn't resist their departure. The doors opened, the car started, and for the first time in weeks, Alexander felt like they were truly free. The drive to the city was uneventful, the landscape shifting from the isolated coastal cliffs to the bustling hum of urban life. Alexander had rented a small apartment in the heart of the city, nothing fancy, just a temporary refuge where they could rebuild their lives. The children seemed to relax as soon as they walked through the door. Theo claimed a corner of the living room for his books, while Lily immediately began decorating her room with drawings of rabbits and flowers. The apartment felt bright, safe, ordinary. It was everything the house had not been. For a time, things felt normal again. Alexander began working remotely, keeping his schedule flexible so he could spend more time with the children. Theo threw himself into school projects and debates, his sharp intellect thriving in the structured environment. Lily started taking art classes, her sketches growing more detailed and vibrant with each passing week. Alexander could see their spirits returning, piece by piece, and it filled him with a quiet relief. But the house hadn't let them go entirely. The first sign came late one night, weeks after they had settled into the apartment. Alexander was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing emails, when he heard a faint sound like the rustle of fabric or the whisper of wind. He froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, his breath caught in his throat. The sound came again, soft and fleeting, as though someone had brushed past him. He turned, expecting to see one of the children, but the kitchen was empty. Just the wind, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, Lily came to him with a drawing. "I made this for her," she said, holding it out to him. The picture was of a woman in a flowing dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her eyes were soft, kind, and unmistakably familiar. "For who, sweetheart?" Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. "For Adeline," Lily said simply. "She's watching us, isn't she?" Alexander's stomach tightened. "What makes you say that?" Lily shrugged. "I just know. She told me she'd keep us safe." Alexander didn't know how to respond. He wanted to tell her that Adeline was gone, that she wasn't coming back. But deep down, he wasn't sure if that was true. The house had its ways of lingering, and Adeline had always been tied to it in ways he didn't fully understand. Maybe she was watching. Maybe she always would be. A week later, Theo found something that made Alexander's doubts even stronger. While unpacking a box of old books, Theo discovered a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't one of theirs, and Alexander didn't recognize it as something from the house. But when Theo opened it, they found pages filled with Adeline's handwriting. Notes, sketches, and fragments of rituals filled the journal, along with a single message written on the inside cover: "For when you need me." Alexander stared at the words for a long time, his mind racing. He didn't know how the journal had gotten there. He didn't know if it was truly from Adeline or if the house had somehow sent it to them as a final reminder of its power. But one thing was certain: Adeline's presence, whether real or imagined, hadn't left them. The final sign came on an ordinary afternoon. Alexander was walking through the park with the children, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs, when Lily suddenly stopped in her tracks. She pointed to a woman sitting on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, her face partially hidden by the brim of her wide hat. "Daddy, look," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "It's her." Alexander followed her gaze, his heart skipping a beat. The woman's posture, her graceful movements were unmistakable. It was Adeline, or someone who looked exactly like her. She turned slightly, as if sensing their gaze, and their eyes met. She smiled, a soft, knowing smile, and tipped her hat in their direction before rising to her feet. "Adeline?" Alexander called, his voice catching. He took a step forward, but Theo grabbed his arm. "Dad, wait," Theo said. "If it's really her, she doesn't want us to follow." Alexander hesitated, torn between the urge to chase after her and the knowledge that Theo might be right. The woman Adeline walked away, disappearing into the crowd as though she had never been there. For the rest of the day, Alexander couldn't shake the image of her smile. It wasn't a goodbye, he realized. It was a reassurance, a reminder that she was still watching, still protecting them, even if they couldn't see her. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him with a sleepy smile. "She's happy," Lily said softly. "She told me." "Who did, sweetheart?" Alexander asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Adeline," Lily murmured, her eyes fluttering closed. "She said we're safe now." Alexander sat by her bedside long after she had fallen asleep, his thoughts swirling. The house was far behind them, its shadows no longer a daily threat. But its mark had been left on them, on their lives, in ways that would never fully fade. Adeline's sacrifice had saved them, but her presence, her memory would always linger, like a faint echo of a song they couldn't forget. As Alexander finally rose and made his way to his own room, he caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror. For just a moment he thought he saw another reflection there, faint and flickering, standing behind him. A woman with soft eyes and a knowing smile. When he turned, the hallway was empty. But as he lay in bed that night, he felt a quiet comfort settle over him, as though someone were still watching, still protecting. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to sleep.